Welcome to the last hurrah for the SU-122-54 on my account, and that is because we've worked our way towards the 2 tier 10s that lead on from this vehicle. And the key thing about this vehicle is that it is brilliant in the right kind of hands. It's probably not new player friendly, but it definitely can be used really well, and because of the DPM of the tank, that really is what makes this thing unbelievable within the game if you get it in those right kind of scenarios. So I'm not saying that this is going to be outrageous and that most people will be able to use this outstandingly. I'm just saying that in the right hands, and you definitely shouldn't be kind of underestimating this vehicle when coming up against it, because it can punish you so hard. And you're going to see that within the next 2 replays that we've got for this SU-122-54. So, as kind of a little bit of a background, for those of you that know about the SU-122 or SU-122-44, which is kind of like the tier 7 version of this vehicle that is a premium, it's a Soviet tank. It has fairly okay armour considering it's a tank destroyer. It's very well angled, which means you can bounce a few rounds, and that is similar to this vehicle right here. It's just that this is the tier 9 version and a little bit more interesting to play because you get 440 alpha damage per shell. You reload in about 6 seconds to do that 440, which is amazing, and so you end up with like a ridiculous DPM in this thing if you're able to consistently deal the damage. And that is kind of the key limiting factor of this vehicle, is that you have to consistently be able to deal the damage, because ultimately this is a non-turreted vehicle, so you do not get that turret to have the flexibility, which can be very limiting in where you can go. But as long as you kind of have that in the back of your head at all times, you're able to kind of counter the negatives of that, so you can have good games. Now, am I saying that you will have good games every game? Am I saying that you will be able to counter it in every game and that it won't be a problem? Well, no, because in quite a few scenarios it will be a problem. This one right here won't be, because what we've set ourselves up with is a nice little position where we can counter some of these heavies that are pushing up pretty aggressively. But remember, you don't really have armor when people are aiming down on you, because your armor, like the thickness of the armor, is fairly low, but you have the great anger, the angle of the armor is really good, so you can bounce rounds that way. So as soon as it starts to become that the enemies are above you, the armor just doesn't work whatsoever. So you have to kind of think about that when playing this vehicle. But in this specific replay, it's a slow burner at the beginning, but it starts to charge up when you think that this is a vehicle that is primarily quite a passive tank destroyer. At least that's the way you think it should be played, because it doesn't have armor really. It's good accuracy, so you'd expect that people will be sniping in this thing. It doesn't get a turret, so you'd be expecting that people want to keep the distance far away so that people can't out-traverse you. But actually, you can play this fairly aggressively so long as you kind of understand the maps, and that is the one kind of crux of a lot of people's problems within World of Tanks, is that the maps and their knowledge of what positions work with certain tanks is kind of limited, so they end up not being able to perform as good as maybe they'd hope. But one thing that you definitely shouldn't do is kind of overexpose yourself in this vehicle, because as soon as you start doing that, you start taking hits, and then suddenly you end up from 1500 hit points all the way down to 0 very quickly. Because this is not a small tank, it is not a tank that relies upon its armor all too much, because the key point about this vehicle is that it is stealthy. It has the ability to remain undetected, and you can use that really well if you can find yourself in a little bush, or you can use some other aspect of the game to kind of benefit you in that regard. Now, there is a type 4 here, which can be a little bit of a problem, but considering the actual rounds that this vehicle has, it's not too much of a problem, because the vehicle has 330 heat pen, I believe, which is more than enough to go through literally 95% of vehicles in the game, straight through the front of them, so regardless of the side armor and stuff like that. So you really don't have many problems in that department. So the actual main armament itself is amazing, so you don't have to kind of worry about that. And also the accuracy of this vehicle is really nice as well, and you're able to use the speed and a kind of mobility mobility in terms of straightforward, because you can't really move in different directions if you're wanting to hit people. So, but nonetheless, you're able to chase down some tanks, and because the speed of the vehicle and also the speed of the reload allow you to kind of miss a few shots here and there as well without really negating all too much from yourself. So you're seeing here we have got ourselves into a bit of a pickle. We've got an Emil 1, or at least an Emil 2 up to our right, which is not a tank that you want to be facing in this, especially when he's above you, so you have to be very careful of that tank. But we've also got the KPZ-50T, so that is the free tank that's available right now. For those of you that don't know, it's the tier 9 German medium. You have to play 40 days in a row or something like that, or complete 40 little daily challenges or something like that. So it's one of those things that you'll be doing over the period of time that you're playing, but yeah, a really good tier 9 medium. But nonetheless, what we were able to do in this tank is find some of those weak points of that medium, and that is hopefully the side of the turret armor of that vehicle. But you're seeing here kind of the boring part of playing things like the SU-122-54, because if the game doesn't develop in a way where you're able to kind of put yourself in the right kind of position, and yes, I could have been in a different position and maybe I'd have done more damage right now, but as the game kind of develops, maybe you'd end up kind of limiting yourself. So sometimes having less damage at the beginning of the game means that you end up with more damage overall, but then sometimes you end up with no damage because you were too passive. And so it relies very much upon your kind of understanding of the game and the flow of the game. And yes, I get it wrong sometimes. In fact, probably more often than I don't. So yeah, I'm not always as good as in the replays that you see, because these are the kind of best replays, or at least some of them, you know, with the limited time that I have to be able to bash out like 7 different replays in a week. So yeah, you can kind of see the sorts of things that you're likely to see within these games in a kind of an average to medium term amount of games. So you're seeing here the Emil 2, which is of course the turreted tank. What you'll notice that I'm actually doing at this point in time is actually counting how many shots he's fired. And so what we'll do is we'll do a little poke on him. We know that we can take at least 3 shells. Well, we can take 2 shells, and of course now he bounces. So that means that whatever happens next, I am going to be able to take him out. And actually he bounces as we come over the ridge, which means we now have 500 hit points. He's going to be reloading because the Emil 2 has 4 shots in its autoloader. It is an autoloader, so you don't have to worry about him now for the next 30 seconds. And so we can use our DPM and the aggressive nature of this vehicle, or at least in this sort of game, to be able to remove him from this game itself. So having done that, what can we do next in this replay? Well, we've got a Tiger 2 that we have to deal with, and then 2 other tank destroyers, one of them being that E4 that we just seen there. Now, a Tiger 2, in all intents and purposes, is pretty weak against this vehicle, so we can just go in after him. But I do want to wait for a little bit of support. You know, you never know if you could bounce a random shot off of the mantler or something goes wrong. Or alternatively, maybe I underestimated how much DPM that the Tiger 2 has, and then we end up getting taken out. But luckily for us, we're able to kind of push up against him and try and take him out as quickly as possible. So we've dealt 4,500 damage now within this replay, which is good for a tier 9. It's nothing spectacular, like beyond spectacular, but it's enough to be able to kind of showcase on this channel. And we've got a better replay in terms of damage in the next game, but one thing that you kind of I felt like this showed is a little bit more of an aggressive playstyle than the one that we're going to showcase next. So you're seeing a bit more of a game where you're forced to actually go in. Ideally, you don't want to be going in like a madman in this vehicle because it is not well adapted for that. But in this sort of scenario, coming up against an E4 and firing down into it, you know, there's not really any problems. Now, this is the time at which we would have been, well, it would have been very nice to actually have some premium rounds, and unfortunately we don't, and that ends up with our demise against the E4 right at the end, which is a little bit frustrating, but there we go. That's my fault for not having as many premium rounds as we could have had if I wasn't firing them willy-nilly during this replay at the beginning. But 4,964 damage, 222 assistance, a fairly decent game, not managing to pick up the mastery badge, but that is for the next game. So showcasing the SU-122-54. Now, to those of you who have made it to this point, this is my favourite replay out of the 2. 2, and that's because it showcases the true aspect of the tank and what it was originally designed for, because this is supposed to be a fairly stealthy tank destroyer, one that kind of sits in the bush. It's able to deal its damage out really quickly, and then you're able to kind of leave or change the flank and then kind of re-engage a different target from a different angle, and you can keep the opponents guessing with these vehicles, which is what they do best, and that's why I absolutely love these. I've always enjoyed playing this vehicle. I've always enjoyed playing the SU-122-44. I've always played some of these tanks like the Object 268, which surprisingly have fairly decent camo and concealment and view range when you actually put on all of the camo perks and stuff like that. So surprising with the kind of high alpha tank destroyers that's the case. But nonetheless, what we're doing here is playing in your typical spot on vineyards, because what you can do, get in this little bush. Of course, a lot of the time you'll be able to notice that some of the trees have fallen down on the opposite side where we just hit someone blind at the beginning of the game. You know, this sort of area that we're looking at here, taking a few new blind shots to see if we can actually hit anyone else. And from this sort of gameplay, what we can do is just be very, very mindful of what we need to do next, and being able to support our team. And talking about supporting our team, the YOLOing IS-7 that's decided to go through the centre of the map against our UDES has somehow continually made it, and he is about to get shut down, at least fingers crossed, before he takes out our friendly UDES there. And of course he does, and only manages to deal like 400 damage to the UDES, which is really, really amazing from that guy. But nonetheless, the other IS-7 also moving forward appears to be in a platoon. We're able to hit him too and shut him down, so both IS-7s taken out of the game. And so yeah, really, really nice start to the game. Picked up 2 enemies already, and of course a blind fire. So this is all stuff that you can do as well, making sure that you just kind of keep your eyes open and adjust to the gameplay, because you never know which way it's going to go. You never know where you're going to be needed. You never know when you're going to need the hit points, so don't throw them all away against some of the kind of opponents that you think are not necessarily kind of important. So make sure that you trade your hit points wisely in a tank like this. You definitely don't want to be going all in. But in this sort of gameplay, I know that the enemy team are pushing down the southern side of the map, and also that because none of our team are particularly that forward thinking, we need to make sure that we're pushing up and spotting the Object 705 and also the medium tank. I believe it's a Leopard here, and also anyone that's going to be sat sniping over on the right hand side, which is typically the tank destroyers who sit and camp on the hill. Yeah, so hopefully we're able to kind of spot some of them, or alternatively deal some damage against some of these people getting spotted and lit up on that hill area as our light tank kind of moves forward. And we try and get a couple of shots into the TNH, but unfortunately not managing to score any more damage in this replay. Don't worry, that does change as we move forward, and you're seeing the utilisation of some of the HE rounds as we go forward as well, which are definitely something I would recommend keeping in the tank. Don't put loads in, you only need about 2 or 3. They're just really for artillery, Waffenträgers, any kind of glass cannon TDs, anything like that. That's what they're brilliant for, because it just secures you some extra damage. But what can we do personally in this replay? Well, you're seeing here us getting a little bit of assistance damage, only 300, but you can definitely secure more. You just have to have set yourself up in the right sort of position at the beginning, and put yourself in the right kind of bush. Now we are constantly trying to spot this 705 and get a little bit of a shell on him, and that happens quite honestly a lot of the time. You're kind of limited by the non-turreted feature of this vehicle, because ultimately not having a turret sucks in World of Tanks. If you can have a turret, you definitely want one, but if you don't have one, it's usually because you get better gun statistics or better armor or something like that. But often I would much rather have the turret to be able to be a little bit more consistent, and sometimes yes, you may have more DPM, but it might be less effective because you're not able to get as many shells or opportunities because you're limited by that turret. So a lot of the time people be like, well, you get extra DPM, so of course it's going to make up for it, but that's not always the case, and often you end up with kind of negating a lot of the DPM that you get. So nonetheless, what you're seeing here, Typical position at the mid-game / later stages. After you've pushed through this area here, you can come up into the bushes and just be a little bit of a nuisance. Obviously, beware when you take down some of these bushes. People can or sometimes have a brain in the game, and they can like kind of pre-aim them or see that the bush has gone down, and then they'll put some rounds into this sort of area. But you're seeing here that the VK keeps getting spotted over to our left, so if we can kind of get a few shells into him, the Waffenträger obviously keeping an eye on the left hand side as to what's surrounding. We know that the Waffenträger is camping on the hill, so if we can find him and load up some HE rounds potentially, we're going to have a great game. But as always, the early game in the SU is always pretty stale, and you end up kind of waiting until the later stages where you can begin carrying, and that's kind of where this vehicle probably sucks for a lot of people, is because they kind of try and be aggressive, they get frustrated or whatever, and then they end up not doing any damage, because the later half of the game is where typically you get the most damage out of tanks like this. But yeah, I can see why. It is very frustrating when you've only done 1,000 damage and it's 7 minutes into the game, but it all changes very quickly, and with a tank like this, because of the DPM, you can make up for that massively. And also the fact that you do have good view range, which allows you to spot tanks like this T30 and anyone that's going to be sat on this hill, along with allowing yourself to get into bushes and stuff like that, which will basically just enable you to remain undetected even more. You can increase your concealment by sitting in the bushes, which is always nice. So that's exactly what we're doing in this replay. Obviously, if you're the furthest forward tank, you're more likely to get assistance damage because you have the view range advantage over someone that's sat behind you. Now, we do spot the waffle here. We then decide to kind of hopefully gauge another shell on him, or at least feather another shell, and you can see here we do manage to do that, and this is where the damage starts racking up, where you're able to consistently see opponents. Unfortunately not managing to hit that final shell. We still know that the VK is over to the left hand side. He's constantly spotted, and potentially we'll be able to get a shell into him, or at least a couple shells if he pulls back down below the ridge line, or at least this bridge. But unfortunately at the minute he doesn't seem to be wanting to do that and giving us free damage. I don't see why not, but there we go. Of course he wants to preserve his hit points and I want to take them, but what can you do in this sort of scenario? Well, we can always reposition, and that is something that I'm thinking right now, and that is exactly what we do. We decide to maybe get into these bushes, give us a better angle on potentially getting a shot into the tracks and constantly perma-tracking the VK. Maybe it will happen, maybe it won't. We try a blind fire, and of course we can't be constantly blind firing in this vehicle because it is limited a little bit by the amount of rounds you have in it. What we do here is get ourselves into this little spot, and we just wait and wait for the VK to kind of pull back. Potentially he will, maybe he won't, and if he doesn't, we'll have to relocate again, and be sure to avoid the waffle who is over to our right somewhere. So at this point I kind of move up into these bushes, and this is really showcasing what I love about the SU, is the fact that you can push up so far and so close to people, and there is no way that they're able to spot you because the concealment of the vehicle is that good. The VK here must be within, what, like 100 meters of us, and he's still not able to spot us, which is why this vehicle is so dangerous. And especially if you pull back behind the bushes and use the bush mechanics to try and get some shells. We didn't manage to pen that one, which is unfortunate, but now we can kind of wait for him to make his next play, going for the top cupola weak point of the VK, or we could go for the mantlet. Either way, it's something we could potentially do, and we go for the shot here, only managing to track the VK. Now our teammate goes off in after him, and luckily for us, the VK then pulls back down, trying to avoid getting hit, but we put a nice round into him nonetheless. And unfortunately our kind of tank gets held up, and actually the VK is not a bot, so he isn't just moving down, but we do manage to put a shell into him regardless. And you can see here that we are still able to not get spotted in this matchup. You can see myself pulling slightly further back. I want to put some bushes in between us and just avoid being hit or detected, because the waffle could come down off that hill any second, and I want to make sure that I have a little bit of distance between me and the tank. Now we're trying to feather a shot into the VK. Can we find it? It doesn't look like we're going to be able to, and then the VK goes up the slope, allowing us to hit into the engine deck of his vehicle, and we secure the final hit on the VK. Now it's after the Waffenträger Alpha E100, who appears to be on the hill, but we have no idea, maybe he's moved, and I've started to load the HE because we've got 3 paper tanks on the enemy team left, 2 of them artillery and the Waffenträger, so all we have to do is hit the lightly armoured portions of them, and of course we spot the Waffenträger, who is on the opposite side of the hill, and we can find the rear of his tank, which is even better, and we place a nice HE round into him. We're now just gonna go for the blind fire again, and of course we hit him once again. Now the M5355 also gets spotted, and we put a nice round into him, finishing him off, and then the enemy artillery, the M5355, the opposite one, also gets spotted, and we finish him. And this is where the reload comes in, and why I say that you should never write off a game in the SU-122-54, and you should never write them off towards the latter half of the game. And you're seeing here us hitting the waffle and actually managing to bounce one, which is a perfect little result towards the end of this gameplay. And hopefully it showcased 2 different styles of playing the SU-122. There's the aggressive kind of forward pushing style that probably doesn't work as much as this version, but this one may be a little bit too boring for you, so maybe a mashup between the two is your kind of ideal, but still able to pick up 5,700 combined damage and managing to pick up 6 enemies destroyed and a whopping 20,000 XP with the ×5 XP boost to try and get towards the Object 263 and of course the Object 268 version 4. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to check out any more tank reviews like tier 10s, we have plenty on the channel. There'll be a tier 10 video on the left hand side and a gameplay and tank reviews playlist on the right. Hopefully you'll join me in one of those, but don't forget to subscribe and like the video because it really helps me out. Probably takes you 2 seconds of your time, so it really does help me out. Please do that. So thank you. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one, and I'll see you there. Goodbye.